Hi, thanks for tuning in to the Asia Gaming Brief podcast series. My guest today is Annamarie Rooding, Director and Principal of Principled Workplace Consulting. And we're here to discuss some of the murkier issues as it relates to mandatory vaccinations in the workplace, which we really only got a chance to scratch the surface in our article yesterday. Annamarie, thanks for joining us and welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So, Annamarie, you're in a really great place to comment on everything that's going on. You're an employment lawyer, you're also a business ethics consultant, and you have a strong background in gaming given your general counsel roles at Tabcorp.
That's right. Yeah, this is an interesting area for me given my areas of expertise.
Yeah. So maybe we'll get into the thick of things. Earlier this month, we heard that MGM Resorts was the first casino operator, possibly in the world, to require all of their 6,000 or so employees to vaccinate. In Asia, in the article yesterday, we all concluded, I think, that it's going to be a little bit more difficult for companies to do the same, unless, of course, an argument can be made that the nature of work requires vaccinations to be justifiable and essential. So what's your take on this? Can it be argued that a frontline casino worker falls into this group?
Look, I think you're absolutely right. It's not a clear-cut position. And I think every industry and every employer is going to have to go through the paces of figuring out what is reasonable and lawful in their environment. There are specific industries that have got public health orders issued on a state-by-state basis. But those are really limited to those extreme risk situations, people working in quarantine and border control. And we covered that in the article yesterday. I think for frontline hospitality, including casinos, the question is really going back to first principles. So assuming there's no automatic contractual obligation, you haven't already, foreseen the pandemic years ago when you did your contracts and put that in place in your EBAs or whatever, exactly. It really is back to first principles. And that is employers have an implied right to issue lawful and reasonable directions to their staff and to discipline staff who don't follow lawful and reasonable directions. Employers have also got very strict obligations under health and safety legislation to take all reasonably practicable steps to prevent harm coming, to mitigate or eliminate risks to health and safety. So the interplay of those two things does suggest to me that if you've got an environment where you've got workers dealing with lots and lots of members of the public who could be vulnerable members of the public, who could carry the virus or who could suffer illness if they contract the virus, you are in that position where you can reasonably start to say, for this cohort of worker, I'm going to say that it's a condition of working in that job that you be vaccinated. Now, the article touched upon, a range of different issues. There are a number of different legal issues that you do need to take into account. And so I think taking a blanket view that every single worker in this business must be vaccinated, which is that mandatory vaccination idea, I just think in the Australian legal context, that's not going to fly. And probably in the social context too, to be honest. But I do think that frontline workers who are exposed, day in, day out because of the nature of their job, that does carry some additional risk and risk to the public, from your business operations and also risk to the individual workers. And in those specific cases, I do think it's worthwhile exploring the possibility of a requirement to vaccinate.
So does that mean there are actually currently laws in place that can be used to require at least the frontline workers to vaccinate? As you mentioned, there's the health and safety requirements that all companies need to abide by, right?
Yeah, unfortunately, there's no legislation that says you must vaccinate your workers. That would be the ideal scenario because then all of the doubt and risk is taken away from the employer. It's always going to be a question of degree. So I think you certainly could rely on your obligations to maintain a safe and healthy workplace. That applies not just to people that work for you, but also anyone who could be affected by your operations, which would include the public. That is a basis on which you could rely on a vaccination situation. But I think what's really important is that we maybe start to get away from this idea of compulsory vaccination or mandatory vaccination and actually focus on the role itself. Is it reasonable to make it a condition of doing that job that the person who does that job, whoever they are, be vaccinated. It sort of takes that issue away from, I require you, Felix, to have this vaccination to get a needle in your arm. Takes it away from that personal exposure to a question of, well, this role is of such risk that we've determined as a business a condition of doing that job. Yeah. Just like a condition might be to wear other PPE, for example, in other industries, mining or whatever. Condition of doing that job is that you be safe, and we've decided that means you need to be vaccinated. There are some alternatives, things like daily testing, etc. But while the testing is largely in the hands of authorities, we don't have a rapid turnaround readily available.
That's actually
see that flying.
It's a really good point you say about mining. There's no employee of a mining company out there that says, I don't want to wear a hard hat because it's my choice. It's just, hey, if you have to work, if you're working here, you're wearing a hard hat because
it's your ticket to play. Exactly. And I think, and that's obviously been driven by, extensive campaigns on health and safety, and obviously the increase in the regulatory focus on, people dying at work. So, there are some really interesting things to emerge in the space, I think, even in terms of workers' compensation. I haven't looked at this in detail, but I think I saw an article that there's been at least a preliminary finding that somebody who had to travel abroad for work contracted COVID and passed away, I think in the United States.
Yeah.
That all of those costs were compensable under workers' comp because they were traveling for work. So, you're sort of damned if you do and damned if you don't as an employer in the space. If you've identified that a role is of sufficiently high risk, and that might include, for example, if the role is in Darwin or Perth, you might not quite yet be in that state because there's zero COVID in those states. And so the risk profile is different. But if you're in Sydney, if there's a reopening in Sydney, and Delta is not brought under control, or even in Melbourne, then in that scenario, I think you are in a situation where you do actually have to take all reasonably practicable steps. And it might well be that a reasonably practicable step is making it a condition of a frontline worker that they be vaccinated. And if somebody's not prepared to be vaccinated, they might have to find an alternative position in that organisation or elsewhere.
Yeah, or you mentioned that they might have to go through daily daily COVID tests to make sure they're negative. Because there will in the end be some people who can't get vaccinated for a health reason, and you can't get rid of them because they have that health condition too. So
Welcome to the minefield of employment law. So you've got discrimination concerns. You've also got to manage very carefully your privacy obligations, because health information is sensitive information under the Privacy Act in Australia. And so there are very strict rules around what you can collect and record. So do you need to employ a COVID vaccination warden who cites people's vaccination certificates but doesn't actually take a copy and ticks a box? There's a whole lot of logistical stuff that can be brought to bear here. But I think the question of testing versus vaccination is a judgment call around, first of all, what availability is there to reliable, cost-effective, regular, fast turnaround testing? Is that as good as vaccination? But also, what are the other alternatives for the way that job can be done? I think that was the comment earlier around not having a blanket rule. If I work for a casino, but I work in their legal or HR department and I can do my job exclusively from home, there's a very different risk profile. And I think it's harder in those scenarios to mandate and to effectively say you can't do your job unless you're vaccinated.
Yeah, and I think, I was reading about Google and Facebook in their headquarters. They had this rule to say, if you're not vaccinated, obviously you're not fired, but you can't come back into the office. And I think that's fair. They can work from home. It's a job that can be done from home. But I wonder, eventually companies are going to want their employees to come back to the office. They're paying big leases on their offices. So they want their employees to be there and to be filling it. But what happens when you get into a situation where employees, some of them are vaccinated, some of them are not vaccinated for whatever reason. So you've got vaccinated people maybe thinking, well, I don't want to work next to somebody who's not vaccinated. So how does a company provide for both? Because they have sort of a responsibility to provide a safe workplace, but at the same time, they can't force people who cannot get a vaccination to get one for their own reasons. So what do they do?
Look, this is going to be a really challenging issue that I think most Australian employers in every industry are going to be grappling with over the next little while. I've seen a headline in the last couple of days that this is an issue around some of the border restrictions that are applying between Queensland and New South Wales, and that actually employee representatives unions might actually be really lending their support to the idea that you've got a right to only work with people who are vaccinated, because that's one of the key ways you can protect yourself at work or be protected from a health and safety risk from this virus. So I think we're going to see a lot more. I think my thoughts for now with employers grappling with this issue is that the most important thing you can do is talk to your staff about what their concerns are. And that goes two ways. It's talk to your people who are resistant to vaccination about what the reasons are. Is it a medical issue? You know, how can that be supported? Is it misinformation in education? How can that be supported? And what are the implications for that person not being vaccinated in the context of the job that they do? Because, you know, that they probably need to be aware that if it's a conditional, you know, role, that they just might actually have to overcome that concern or find a different, you know, alternative position. For the people who are concerned about working with unvaccinated colleagues, I also think those concerns are validly held. And I think, you know, I think the best an employer can do is ask its people to be open-minded and calm and respectful in these conversations, but to really focus in on what matters, which is everybody being healthy and safe at work, but also psychologically healthy and safe. So we really want to avoid situations where people who might not be able to be vaccinated for health reasons, for example, are not being made out to be villains or, unfit to be in the office. So it's sort of maintaining that level of civility. But I think employers have got some hoops to jump through here in terms of how they bring people in teams working together and really get creative about what the alternatives might be. I do think one of the other issues that employers are going to have to grapple with as part of providing a safe workplace and doing everything reasonably practicable is what can employers do to facilitate, to make it as easy as possible for people who are willing or who are on the borderline to get their jab, whether that's arranging on-site, lots of information, translation into all of the, you know, languages that the workforce, has. I think that will be critical as well.
Yeah, it brings me on to the next question or point that I wanted to make, which is I feel like a lot of the issues that are around vaccine hesitation and all these issues related to the workplace, it comes down to how socially acceptable this vaccine has been. And I think I mentioned this in a previous call. One of my relatives couldn't sleep the night before getting her vaccine because, she was actually worried that she might not come out of it alive, because of all that media hype around blood clots and heart issues and this and that. So, I mean, how much of these problems are actually caused by this media hype around side effects?
I've got no doubt that that is part of the concern. I mean, I've, worked in organisations and I'm aware of organisations over many years bringing in flu vaccination arrangements, whooping cough vaccinations when there's been because there are pregnant workers who might be impacted by a small outbreak of, these things happen day in, day out in organisations. This one, I think, because of the heightened anxiety state that we're all in, just comes with a hell of a lot of baggage and concern and misinformation. I think for me, there's no doubt that this has become a political issue as well as a medical issue. It really is, I think, a result of a lot of the shifts that we've seen over the last sort of 5 years around the world from civic duty to personal liberty and personal freedom. I've got the right, I'm entitled to my opinion, even if it's, contrary to decades old medical evidence. So I think those issues are going to be really challenging in this space. And again, I come back to, if I'm an employer and I want to get back to business, I want to protect my people, I want to protect my customers and just, get back to some sense of normality. What can I do? I think the key things are communicate with your people and make sure that you are providing or at least channeling to your workforce as much real evidence-based information as you can in as many languages as possible. Because I think, the only way that people are going to have their opinions shifted is if somehow they can believe that they don't need to be afraid. They need to understand what the consequences are of having the jab. They don't need to be afraid because I think fear is doing a lot of damage and emboldening a lot of people. Yeah.
Well, can I just announce that AGB is vaccinated, all of our staff here. So
So are all of the staff of Principled Workplace Consulting.
There you go. So yeah, education is key, and you know, it's a vaccine. You know, it shouldn't be so scary, but I can understand why there are people who are scared of it.
Look, nobody likes to have a needle, you know, but it's for your good and it's for the good of everybody around you. So it's the right thing to do.
Exactly. Well, thanks, Annamarie, for your thoughts today. It's been a pleasure to speak to you as always. Thanks again for joining our podcast.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And that was an Asia Gaming Brief podcast all about mandatory vaccinations. Your guest today has been Annamarie Rooding, business and ethics lawyer of Principled Consulting. You can reach her on LinkedIn searching for Annamarie Rooding, or her business website at principledworkplace.com.au. To keep up with the latest issues to impact the Asian gaming industry, be sure to follow us on agbrief.com.